Introverted intuition, otherwise known as the woo-woo function, the function largely associated with the supernatural, the psychic, the metaphysical, and the profound. While not many people seem to agree on what introverted intuition actually is, there is one thing all of these various definitions have in common. And this is the tendency to portray introverted intuition as a lot more interesting than it actually is. And generally speaking, the more popular and widely accepted definitions of introverted intuition tend to describe the function as having a kind of laser focus, a very linear internal trajectory. And what's interesting about these more commonly accepted definitions of this function is they happen to be both accurate and inaccurate at the same time. What do I mean by this? Well, if you describe introverted intuition as locking onto anything within the brain, you're not actually describing introverted intuition, but you are nonetheless describing a conclusion arrived at after the employment of introverted intuition. So if you place a thought process of an introverted intuitive on a kind of timescale, at this end you have the conception of an idea, and at this end you have the conclusion. What modern definitions of introverted intuition tend to do is focus entirely on this end, on the conclusion of introverted intuition rather than the actual employment. So if you go all the way back here to the conclusion of an introverted intuitive process, you do very much have someone who's locked on to an internal linear trajectory. This very much upholds the idea of introverted intuition being this kind of internal laser function. However, the problem here is people are associating the effect with the cause. They are describing a symptom of an introverted intuitive process without actually describing what introverted intuition is actually doing. And to do that, we need to jump all the way back to the conception of an idea. And herein lies the irony, because introverted intuition itself is the exact opposite of what it's actually considered to be. Introverted intuition is not a laser-focused function. It is not even a linear function. When people talk about the linearity of introverted intuition, they are making the behavioral psychological mistake of associating a confidence in a function's employment with the function itself. So focusing on the conception of an idea and the actual process of using introverted intuition, this function is the exact opposite of what it is commonly portrayed to be. And what it is remarkably simple. It's got nothing to do with the psychic, the metaphysical, the underlying substrate behind reality. No, introverted intuition is nothing more than a broad lens directed internally to encompass a vast scope of the internal landscape. And in order to arrive at any kind of certain introverted intuitive conclusion, any kind of linear trajectory, introverted intuition must first do what it does best. So taking the abstract language off the table for a minute, let's say you're walking outside. You're not focusing on anything in particular, you are employing your peripheral vision. You'll notice when employing this style of perception that as soon as there's a sudden change within a world, as soon as there's any abrupt movement, you immediately lock onto that specific thing. You immediately go into alert mode. However, you could only lock onto the specific object in the first place because you were initially employing your peripheral vision. Direct this gaze internally and you have introverted intuition zooming into introverted sensing. You see, when you notice that sudden and abrupt movement within the external world and you lock onto it, you are no longer engaging your peripheral vision. This is exactly how introverted intuition works within the internal world. You are initially surveying a vast portion of your mind, but as soon as a correlation is perceived, you lock onto it. However, when you lock onto something within your brain, you are no longer using introverted intuition. Introverted intuition was simply the lens which was necessary to perceive that initial mental association. So wait, if once you've locked onto a specific idea, once you've locked onto a specific value within your brain, isn't introverted intuition, what is it? Well, just as introverted intuition is that broad scope that lacks a degree of focus and clarity, it is introverted sensing which locks onto those specific components. So somewhat ironically, when people are describing an introverted intuitive conclusion, they're actually describing the secondary process of an introverted intuitive dialogue whereby a person has to employ introverted sensing in order to focus on that which has been peripherally perceived. But you see, introverted intuition and introverted sensing technically don't exist. They are simply words to describe opposing ends on a perceptual continuum. Because when you go on for a walk outside, you notice that your vision is constantly fluctuating between a peripheral broad scope and a very focused and intense gaze. This is exactly how introverted intuition and introverted sensing work. And the only difference between an introverted intuitive dialogue and an introverted sensing dialogue is where these particular dialogues begin. Because an introverted intuitive dialogue begins with a zoomed out perspective. It starts with a broad scope and then subsequently hones in on the details. Whereas introvert sensing, it starts with the details and then expands outwards to encompass a broader scope. And as such, these two functions can actually arrive at very similar conclusions. They just do so from a different starting position. So why is it then that introverted intuition is associated with being deep on some level? Well, this is partially to do with the everyday use of the word deep. Usually in a modern contemporary setting, it is a word used to imply the kind of antonym to taking things at face value. It is a word used to imply a kind of underlying meaning. If you were in any way deep, you were going beyond the surface level. You were not taking things at face value. However, the use of the word deep can be very misleading here because introverted intuition is in fact very surface level because it sacrifices depth and intensity for breadth of scope. But the conclusions an introverted intuitive can reach can indeed be very deep and very detailed. But this depth is not introverted intuition itself, at least not on cognitive terms. And again, there's a massive irony to this entire thing because the introverted intuitive perception of an internal landscape relies upon generalizations in order to essentially fill in the gaps in perception. It relies heavily upon assumption and hypothesis. And it is very much true that the less an introverted intuitive trains their introverted sensing dip, the more that they will rely upon these very generalizations, and the more perpetually vague their internal perception will be. And it is in these very somewhat rare instances when an introverted intuitive will make huge wild leaps of logic in order to essentially overcompensate for their lack of internal detail. For example, introverted intuition tends to have a certain predictive capability because again, you're perceiving a vast landscape and therefore you're aware of trends within your brain. When somebody's speaking to you and using an argument you are already familiar with, you may very well be able to predict what they are going to say next. However, in order to understand your prediction of what the person is saying comes from a previous experience or comes from a series of associations within your brain, you must go through a fairly extensive employment of introverted sensing in order to lock onto specifically what has caused this predictive response. However, it would be much easier for an introverted intuitive with a particularly lazy mind to instead conclude that this prediction came from a higher power, or to conclude that they are on some level psychic, clairvoyant. And the same things could happen in terms of coincidences. Coincidences often don't actually exist, but in order to understand what has caused this very similar sequence of outcomes, one must activate a certain degree of introverted sensing analysis. One must focus on the details of a sequence of events. And is it only, say, introverted intuition dominance, introverted intuition diversion to auxiliaries that make such assumptions? Absolutely not. Oftentimes it is people with a unconscious introverted intuition who are more likely to engage introverted intuition in this particularly lazy manner. And I've had multiple conversations with fairly low SI activated introverted intuitives over the years, whereby they make a kind of blanket general statement and automatically assume that this statement will apply to every single person on the planet, absolutely irrespective of context and circumstances. All because the mind in question was unwilling to face the details of the individual circumstances, was unwilling to come to terms with the fact that every single person is different on some level. Because for the more lazy introverted intuitive, it is oftentimes so much easier to make a vast sweeping generalization in order to make life entirely predictable, so that one never has to come to terms with the details, and one can continue to occupy a fairly easy existence. So why is it then that introverted intuition, despite its fairly low resolution perception of the internal world, gravitates towards the profound, gravitates towards the complex? Well, this is because on this extreme end of this perceptual continuum, while the introverted intuitive scope tends to lack a degree of focus and detail, it is still very much aware of the general palette of the mind it is encompassing. So for example, when something within the brain is not adding up, when there's a conflicting value, it is the introverted intuitive who is much more likely to be aware of this discrepancy. Because while on the other end of this perceptual continuum, introverted sensing will be locking onto something very specific, introverted intuition cannot help but perceive all of these discrepancies at exactly the same time. And this leads intuitive dominance across the board, particularly ENFPs and INFJs, attached as their introverted intuition is to an objective codec, to hastily rush to judgments, to hastily overly simplify any given agglomeration of discrepancies within the mind. Because the individual is so often impatient to find a way, to find a shortcut so oftentimes, to bringing what is perceived back into a state of relative equilibrium. And as such, a high magnitude introverted intuition, occupying the extreme end of the perceptual continuum, alongside a particularly lazy mind which is unwilling to dip into introverted sensing in order to concern itself with the details, is extremely likely to act like a child whose room is untidy. The child whose room is untidy is just going to get a brush and sweep all of the various toys that are on the floor under the bed. This is how introverted intuitive assumptions works. And you can think of the toys underneath this bed as a kind of linear conclusion. And as such, the conclusions of introverted intuition are not necessarily any better than those of introverted sensing. Because while, say, these internal discrepancies within the mind of an introverted sensor, particularly one with a very low degree of introverted intuitive activation, are akin to a particularly messy room, there's actually no more mess in this instance between the mind of the introverted sensor and the introverted intuitive. The difference here is the introverted intuitive was highly aware of that mess, and they had that kind of itch that they needed to scratch. But because they were feeling particularly lazy and they didn't want to focus on the details, they just took a great sweep and brushed all of those toys under the bed. They can no longer see them, but it doesn't change the fact that they are still there. While as compared to the lazy introverted intuitive, the lazy introverted sensor is being unwilling to activate an introverted intuitive perspective, and therefore they're subsequently unaware of the clutter within this particular bedroom analogy. However, they are still very focused on the linear trajectory in front of them, and therefore they have cleared a very neat path to avoid tripping up over any of these given bits of clutter. And therefore both of these ends within the perceptual continuum are just as bad as each other. Both of the children within these analogies have taken precautions to ensure they do not trip up within their given trajectories. As the introverted intuitive child wants to encompass all of the room at once, they must shove all of the different discrepancies under the carpet or under the bed. Whereas the introverted sensing child has a very fixed trajectory, so that means they're never going to veer away from the path that they have constructed, from the path that they have cleared within their room. However, in both instances, there is an equal amount of clutter, and both of these types are equally lazy in their own way. And as such, in order to reach logical conclusions, in order to have a mind which has essentially achieved a state of equilibrium, whereby there are no longer any conflicting values within the brain, neither of these functions are any more rational or any more deep or any more profound or any more effective at reaching solid conclusions than the other one. Because introverted intuition without any kind of introverted sensing dip relies upon generalizations in order to essentially blind oneself to the discrepancies. Whereas introverted sensing without any kind of introverted intuitive dip relies upon a very narrow and fixed tunnel vision within the mind that never ever has to contend with the vast array of discrepancies that lie beyond that focal point. But thankfully, these cases are extremely few and far between. Most introverted intuitives have a very high degree of introverted sensing dip. Most introverted sensors have a very high degree of introverted intuitive activation. And while I'll probably be making a more thorough video on this topic at a later date, I do want to say as a final disclaimer, introverted intuition is not psychic. It is not mystical. It is not connected to any kind of deep reality. And the introverted intuitive perception is definitely not more scientific than that of introverted sensing. Indeed, a nice way to portray either end of this perceptual continuum is to describe introverted sensing as a hard science and introverted intuition as a soft science. Because the more broad scope of introverted intuition proclivicates a function towards a kind of theoretical disposition, the conception of an idea, a hypothesis, whereas it is introverted sensing, honing as it does on the details, that can essentially test these hypotheses in the first place. But that's just my introverted intuitive generalization. So what is introverted intuition? It is nothing more than a broad scope directed internally. It is not assigning value, and it's not even creating associations within the mind, because the association element of introverted intuition relies completely upon the codec to which it is assigned. And therefore the ENFP and the INFJ are more likely to make objective generalizations, whereas the generalizations of the ENTP and the INTJ tend to be more subjective in nature. And this is because the INFJ and the ENFP have a thinking codec attached to their introverted intuitive lens, whereas the very same introverted intuitive lens of the INTJ and the ENTP is attached to a feeling codec. So just as a final disclaimer, introverted intuition does not exist within a vacuum. It is simply a mode of perception. And any kind of rational agenda you will assign to this function depends completely upon the codec to which this function is attached within any given type. So thank you so much for watching that, especially if you made it this far, you are awesome. If you haven't already done so, make sure to click that subscribe button down below with the bell icon next to it, that way you can stay notified of future content. And if you enjoyed the video, let me know by hitting that like button. And just a quick reminder, if you want to learn more about CPT, I do have a dedicated CPT ebook. And if you're uncertain of your type or just want more clarity as to how it pertains to you, I do have a dedicated CPT type service as well. And a final call to action, CPT is now on Patreon, so if you want to support the channel and this new fluid system on that additional level, that would be massively, massively appreciated. But of course, it goes without saying that I already massively appreciate your viewership. So I'll be back in a few days' time, but for now, take care of yourself.